some moments in history that seem to slip in quietly, unnoticed by anyone actually living through them. I imagine that's how the majority of us live our lives. We don't see that anything that we do or say in the moment is necessarily going to be remembered in years to come. But on June 1st of 1495, one of those quiet little moments was written down in Scotland. It didn't come with a celebration. It didn't come with any kind of ceremony. It came as a simple instruction recorded in the Exchequer rolls, telling a friar named John Cor to take 8 bowls of malt and turn it into aqua vitae. The phrase aqua vitae means water of life. It sounds kind of poetic. It's not like something you would expect from a philosopher or a priest that was standing before a congregation. In reality, it was a practical instruction tied to barley, fire, and time. Well, does that sound a little bit like beer to you? Well, it's similar. That one line became the earliest known written record of what we now call Scotch whiskey. The man at the center of the record, John Cor, is not a figure surrounded by legend in the way later whiskey makers would be necessarily. There are no detailed portraits of him at work. There's no dramatic stories handled down in taverns, no clear account of the day that carried out that order. What we do have is his name tied to a task preserved in a ledger that was never meant to create a legacy. That's how often history begins. Now, it's not beginning with grand intention, but it's beginning with a necessity. I don't know how many people would say that whiskey was necessarily a necessity, but I've known a few that might say that it is. John Cor is believed to have been a mendicant friar, likely part of a religious order that valued things like discipline and learning, and in some cases, labor. Monks across Europe had long been involved in the brewing and distilling of different things, mainly wines and beers. They worked the land, they tended to orchards, they brewed the ale, and they experimented with methods of creating distilled spirits. These were not idle hobbies. They were tied to survival and trade and medicine and daily life. The connection to the Lindores Abbey in Fife is one that has been argued and supported and questioned and reinforced over time. They highly support the theory that he worked there specifically. Of course they do. Some historians point to other possible locations, including Edinburgh, while whiskey tradition leans strongly toward Lindores. The reason is not just romantic attachment. There are records of a man named John Caw, K-A-W-E, instead of C-O-R-R. Possibly the same person as John Cor. John Caw, John Cor is not that big of a difference. So John Caw was apparently working in the financial administration of the Abbey's surrounding area. Names were kind of fluid in that time. They were spelled as they sounded. It shifted from one document to another without concern for the consistency. And a lot of this had to do with the levels of illiteracy at the time. There wasn't a standard way of spelling a lot of people's surnames because a lot of people didn't know how to spell. But what matters more than the exact spelling is the setting. The Lindores Abbey was not an isolated place of quiet reflection that was cut off from the world like you would normally think of a monastery being. This place was active and connected and involved in trade and architecture and agriculture and production. The monks were known to brew ale, and the region itself was tied to orchards and grain production. The tools, the knowledge, the resources that they needed to produce the aqua vitae they were asked to produce were all within reach of this particular location. But the order itself came from James IV of Scotland. He was a ruler known for his curiosity and his interest in learning, and his willingness to involve himself in matters both practical and intellectual. The man was a thinker. When he requested that 8 bolls, B-O-L-L-S, by the way, oh, not bowls, of malt be used to produce the aqua vitae. He was not making some kind of a casual suggestion. He was directing resources toward a particular purpose. 8 bowls is not, like I said, bowls. This is not a small amount. It represents a quality and quantity of grain that could produce a significant volume of spirits. It was not a personal experiment carried out in a corner of a monastery. This was an organized and deliberate and substantial undertaking. For a long time, people assumed that early distilled spirits like this were primarily medicinal. Aqua vitae was often used as a remedy, believed to warm the body, to treat illness, to preserve health, and some people believe it was used to kill the germs and bacteria often found in water. Monasteries, with their knowledge of herbs and natural remedies, were logical places for such production to happen. A monk distilling a spirit to treat the sick fits comfortably within the image of what a monk in a monastery would naturally be doing. But the story doesn't sit as neatly as all that. There's another possibility. And it's one that shifts the meaning of that 1495 record in a way that changes how we first understand the first documented Scotch whiskey. At that time, James IV was engaged in efforts to bring the Western Isles under stronger royal rule. Campaigns like that require more than swords and ships. They require morale and supplies. They require something that steadies a man when the outcome is still uncertain. So some historians believe that aqua vitae, produced from these 8 bowls of malt, was intended not just as medicine, but as a part of provisioning for the king's forces. If that is true, then the first recorded Scotch whiskey was tied not to the healing within the stone walls, but to movement and conflict and the practical needs of men preparing for action. That shifts the image entirely. The so-called water of life becomes something more than a tonic. It becomes a tool. The geography supports this possibility in a weird way. Lindores Abbey stood not far from Falkland Palace. It was a palace that was frequently used by the king, King James. There were established connections between the abbey and to royal activity. Goods moved between these two locations. Messages were carried, resources were shared. A production of spirit in one place could easily serve a need in another. The spirit itself would not have resembled modern Scotch whiskey, of course. There was no long aging process in oak barrels at that time. This rich, wonderful smell and flavor that you have now, you probably wouldn't have a lot of that back then. The product would have been clear and raw, and it would have been the immediate product, not the aged flavors of the product. It may have carried flavors from fruit or grain closer to a rough brandy than the deep, complex whiskey that it's known as today. It would have been strong and effective and direct. In other words, it would have done its job, but that's about it. But what makes this moment remarkable is not just the production of the spirit, but the fact that it was written down. Countless acts of brewing and distilling and experimentation have been lost to time because nobody ever recorded them. Here, in a financial document meant to track the movement of goods and money, was something preserved that would later define a national identity. The Exchequer rolls were not written to create stories of people. They were written to account for transactions. They recorded what was given, what was received, and really what was expected. They were practical documents concerned with order and accountability. Yet within that structure, they captured a moment that would outlive their original purpose. John Cor appears once, only once, does his work, and then fades from the record completely. There are no hints of him anywhere else in the records. No possible connections, no payments, no references to the cloth, no references to service, to administrative roles. Nothing like that exists. His name is nowhere else. But there is no grand narrative that follows him through life. There's no detailed accounts of his thoughts, his ambitions, his feelings. Yesterday, I talked about the incredible 6-volume diary that covered a man's thought processes and feelings that were probably 200 years before this, that spanned a 9-year span of this person's life. And here we have something that is exactly the opposite. John Cor does not stand in history as a personality. He stands as a point, just a pinpoint. That absence of detail leaves room for interpretation, sure, but it also highlights something important. History does not always preserve the people who start something. It often preserves the results. Over time, whiskey would become more than a product. It would become a craft, a tradition, an industry, even a symbol. Techniques would improve and distillation methods would refine, and aging in oak barrels would add depth and character. And if you've ever had a sherry cask aged whiskey, it's even better, and it has a deeper, almost reddish tone to it. Oh, very nice. But regions would eventually start to develop their own styles all over Scotland. Names would emerge attached to distilleries: Macallan, Glenfiddich, Balvenie, Arbor. These are just some of my own personal favorites. And they would not only emerge attached to distilleries, but also to families and entire reputations. Even The Simpsons did an entire episode dedicated to a whiskey manufacturing company in Scotland. It was done through the friendship of Bart Simpson and groundskeeper Willie. It was a fabulous episode. If you ever get a chance to watch it, I highly recommend it, just because it's a lot of fun. But all of that stuff came later on. In 1495, this was still a task that was just written down in a ledger. The monks who worked the grain and fire did not think of themselves as founders of an industry by any means. They were fulfilling roles that combined labor and knowledge and obligation, and that was it. Their work connected the land to the people who depended on it. It connected the king's authority to the resources required to maintain it. And in that connection, something lasting really did take shape. The debate over John Cor's identity, whether he was connected to the Lindores Abbey or somewhere else in Edinburgh or somewhere else entirely, all of this reflects a larger truth about the history of whiskey. Records are incomplete, names change, details are lost. What remains is often a fragment, and from that fragment, we build an understanding that is never entirely fixed. Researchers have spent years examining documents, comparing references, tracing people's links between John Cor and John Cor. He was a figure that was tied to Newburgh and the financial affairs of the abbey there. The evidence suggests a connection, but the certainty remains just slightly out of reach. That uncertainty doesn't weaken the story, though. It actually strengthens it. It reminds us that history, especially history like this, is not a finished account. It's a process shaped by discovery and interpretation and the limits of what has survived. The entry from June 1st of 1495 stands as the earliest written evidence of whiskey production in Scotland. It does not claim to be the first time it was ever made. Distillation was already known in Europe. Monks had been working with it for centuries at that point. What it gives us is a fixed point, a moment where production, purpose, and record all meet. From that point, a line can be drawn forward through centuries of change, refinement, and expansion to the global presence of Scotch whiskey in the way it is today. Yet it all rests on something deceptively simple. A king made a request, a friar carried it out, and a clerk wrote it all down. And that was enough. So here's the question for you to consider with today's entry. If that one line in the Escher rolls had never been written down, if John Cor had done his work without it being recorded, would whiskey still carry the same sense of origin, or would it still feel incomplete without that first written trace? Whiskey, by the way, without the E. In Scotland, it is spelled Whisky. Drop the E. They got enough E's in Scotland. And if you've ever lived in Scotland, you know what that means. Anyway, tell me what you think in the comments, because sometimes the smallest records do shape the biggest legacies. But how do you feel it did in this instance? And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments. And subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. As you know, every subscriber helps, every comment, like, share, all of that stuff. It all helps others to see the episodes, and it helps me to keep doing what it is that I do every single day. Thank you for watching.